The wind on Caldris Reach smelled like burnt copper that afternoon, thick with dust from the red cliffs east of the colony. Nora Callahan pulled her scarf higher over her nose and kept walking, her boots crunching over loose gravel as she scanned the ground for samples. She was not supposed to be out this far alone. The survey line ended half a kilometer back, but the plant she was chasing, a strange blue-veined moss that only grew near old rock breaks, had led her further than she planned. She almost turned back twice. The light was already turning orange, and Ridgeline Station's fence lights would start blinking soon, calling every worker home before the cold set in. But then she heard it, a small, broken sound, somewhere between a cry and a cough, coming from a pile of collapsed stone ahead of her. Nora stood still and listened. The sound came again, weaker this time. She told herself it was probably a wind hare or one of the burrow lizards that lived in the cliffs, but something about the sound pulled at her chest, and she found her feet moving toward it before she had really decided to go. The rockslide looked recent, maybe a few days old. Broken stone was piled high, and beneath it, half buried, she saw something dark and small. At first she thought it was an animal that had died there. Then it moved. She dropped to her knees and began pulling stones away with her bare hands, ignoring the way the sharp edges cut into her palms. Under the rubble was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen up close, though she had heard stories about them from the older colonists. Black scales, still soft and thin because it was young, folded wings pressed tight against its body, two small horns just starting to show above its eyes. It was starving, its ribs showing clearly through its scales, and one of its wings was bent at a wrong angle. Around it, half buried in the same rubble, were three more shapes, smaller and completely still. Nora understood without needing to be told. This had been a nest. Something had attacked it, or the rocks above had simply given way, and only this one hatchling had survived. She knew the colony rules. Commander Daniel Reyes had said it clearly during her first week on Caldris Reach: no contact with native wildlife, and absolutely no contact with anything resembling a Vidrakin, the reptile species the locals sometimes called dragons because of their size when grown and the fire that lived in their throats. The rule was strict enough that it had its own separate briefing, its own warning sheet, its own line in her contract. Nora had read all of it. She was breaking every part of it right now, and she barely thought about that at all. The hatchling flinched away from her hand at first, baring small teeth that trembled more than they threatened. Nora slowed down and lowered her voice, the way she used to talk to frightened animals back home before she ever left Earth. "Hey," she said softly, "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." It watched her with eyes the color of dark violet glass, wide and wet and exhausted. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a ration bar, breaking off a small piece and holding it out on her open palm instead of pushing it toward the creature's mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the hatchling stretched its neck forward and took the piece from her hand, swallowing it almost too fast. Nora felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of worry she hadn't noticed until it was gone. She broke off another piece and another, feeding the small creature bit by bit while she gently worked at freeing its trapped leg from the stones. It let her touch it now, its thin body trembling less with each passing minute. "You're just a baby," she murmured, mostly to herself, running a careful finger along the ridge of its spine. "Poor thing, all alone out here." She looked at its scared, hollow little face, at the way it pressed slightly into her hand instead of pulling away. "You're kind of cute, you know that." The moment the words left her mouth, the hatchling's eyes flashed bright violet, a sudden light that seemed to come from somewhere deep behind its pupils rather than from any outside source. Nora froze, her hand still resting on its back. The light lasted only a second or two before fading, but in that time the air around them seemed to hum, like a held breath finally let go. The hatchling made a soft, low sound, almost like a purr, and pressed its head firmly against her palm. Nora didn't know what had just happened, but her radio was already crackling. She had triggered a proximity alert hours ago just by wandering this far from the survey line, and now Ridgeline Station's ground team was on its way. When the rover pulled up minutes later, it wasn't just security officers who climbed out. Beside them was Administrator Voss, the station's alien liaison, a tall, thin being from a neighboring system who usually handled trade paperwork and had never once come out on a field call. Voss took one look at the small black creature curled against Nora's chest and went very still. "Put it down," Voss said, voice tight. "Slowly, right now." "It's hurt," Nora said, confused by the sudden fear in the alien's tone. "I couldn't just leave it." Voss stepped closer, careful and slow, studying the hatchling's eyes as if checking for something specific. Whatever they saw made their shoulders drop. "You didn't just save it," Voss said quietly. "You just became the single most important thing in its entire existence. That bond does not break, Miss Callahan, not by choice, not by force, not ever." Behind them, the sun finished sinking below the red cliffs, and the little dragon in Nora's arms let out a soft, satisfied breath, as if it had finally found something it had been searching for its whole short life. News on a small colony travels faster than sound, and by the next morning, almost everyone at Ridgeline Station knew that Nora Callahan had walked back through the gates carrying a baby dragon. Some people laughed about it in the mess hall like it was a funny story. Others were not laughing at all. Administrator Voss called an emergency meeting before breakfast was even finished. Nora sat at the edge of the room with the hatchling wrapped in a blanket on her lap, feeling like she was on trial for something she still did not fully understand. Commander Daniel Reyes sat across from her, arms crossed, listening as Voss explained what the colony was now dealing with. "Vidrikin bonding is not a myth or an old story," Voss said, packing slowly. "It is documented, tracked, and heavily restricted across every system the Threnny Combine controls. Once a hatchling bonds to someone, that connection becomes permanent. The creature will defend that person without limit. It will not listen to reason, training, or authority. It listens only to them." Voss pointed at Nora. "That is why full-grown Vidrikin are considered one of the most dangerous creatures in the region. Not because they attack without cause, but because once they have a cause, nothing stops them." "So what happens now?" Reyes asked. "By treaty law, an unregistered bond like this is supposed to be reported, and the creature surrendered to a Combine containment facility," Voss said, "for its own safety and for everyone else's." Nora's arms tightened around the small dragon without her meaning to. The hatchling, sensing the tension in her body, let out a low, sharp hiss toward Voss, its tiny claws digging gently into the blanket. "You are not taking it," Nora said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Look at it. It's a baby. It just watched its whole family die under a pile of rocks. I'm not handing it over to strangers in a cage." Voss opened their mouth to argue, but Reyes raised a hand first. "Send the report," he told Voss. "Tell them exactly what happened. But we are not ripping a creature away from the one person it has bonded to, not until we understand what that would even do to it. That's final for now." Voss did send the report that same day, and far away, in a Combine command post orbiting a neighboring system, the message landed on the desk of a fleet commander named Ossian Threll. He read it twice, unable to quite believe it. A human, an unimportant colonist from a barely tolerated species, had somehow triggered a full Vidrikin bond. Threll set the report aside with a short, humorless laugh and gave the order to adjust course toward Caldris Reach. If the report was true, it needed to be handled properly. If it was false, someone on that colony was about to have a very bad week. None of that reached Ridgeline Station yet. For now, life simply had to include a dragon. The hatchling, whom Nora had started calling Rook because of his ink-black scales, grew faster than anyone expected. Within days, he had learned to follow her from room to room. Curling up under her bunk at night and refusing food from anyone else's hand, no matter how hungry he was. The colony's engineers built a reinforced pen near the greenhouse dome, part enclosure and part shelter, though it quickly became clear that walls meant very little to him. The first time a supply drone flew too close to Nora while she carried a tray of food across the yard, Rook let out a sharp screech and a burst of heat from his throat that melted one of the drone's rotor blades clean off. "He didn't even think about it," Nora said later, half amazed and half worried, as the colony's mechanic Priya Nandan inspected the ruined drone. "It scared him, and it was near me, and that was it." "That's the part that worries me," Priya said, not unkindly. "He's the size of a large dog right now. What happens when he's the size of a building?" It was a fair question, and Nora did not have an answer for it. What she did have, though, was a strange and growing sense of comfort whenever Rook was near. He learned the shape of her moods almost instantly, nudging his head under her hand when she was tired, staying quiet and still when she needed to focus, growling low and protective whenever a stranger came too close during her sleep. The bond Voss had warned her about did not feel like a burden. It felt, in a way she could not quite explain to anyone else, like having a piece of family she never knew she was missing. Not everyone on the station felt the same warmth. Whispers moved through the corridors about the danger a grown Vidrikin could bring to their small, exposed colony, about treaties broken and combine attention drawn to a place that had survived so far by being ignored. Voss kept receiving updates from Combine channels, each one shorter and colder than the last, and each one making it clearer that this matter was no longer staying quiet. Late one evening, as Nora sat by the enclosure fence with Rook's head resting heavy in her lap, Voss came to find her. Expression unusually grave, even for an alien face, Nora still struggled to read. "A Combine warship has changed its heading," Voss said quietly. "It is coming here, to Caldrus Reach, to Ridgeline Station." Rook lifted his head slightly, as if he understood something in the air had shifted, and let out a low, steady growl toward the darkening sky. 6 months change a lot of things, and on Caldrus Reach they changed Rook the most. The small creature Nora had once carried home, wrapped in a blanket, now stood nearly as tall as her waist, with wings that had grown strong enough to lift him a few feet off the ground when he got excited. His scales had darkened from soft black to something closer to polished obsidian, catching the light in strange, shifting colors whenever he moved. The reinforced pen near the greenhouse had been rebuilt twice already, each time larger, and each time proven completely unnecessary the moment Rook simply decided he wanted to be somewhere else. He never wandered far from Nora, though. That much had not changed at all. Their days had settled into something like a rhythm. Nora still worked with the botany team, cataloging the strange plant life across the region, and Rook now went with her almost everywhere, trotting along beside the survey rovers or gliding short distances between the rock formations while she worked. The other colonists had mostly stopped flinching every time he passed by, though a few, like Logistics Officer Priya Nandan, still kept a careful, respectful distance. "I'm not scared of him," Priya said one afternoon, watching Rook nap in a patch of sunlight outside the supply depot. "I'm scared of what happens the day something actually threatens Nora while he's standing right there." She did not have to wait long to find out. It happened on a supply run to the southern ridge, where a small group of raiders, opportunists who had drifted into the system, hopping to steal from an undefended colony, ambushed one of Ridgeline's transport crews. Nora was riding along that day to collect soil samples, with Rook curled in the back of the rover as usual, half asleep, until the first shots rang out against the vehicle's hull. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, though it felt much longer to everyone who lived through it. Rook was up and moving before Nora even understood what the sound meant, his wings snapping open as he launched himself between her and the raider's position. A stream of white-hot fire poured from his throat, scorching a line across the rocks just in front of the attackers, close enough to make it clear the next one would not miss on purpose. One of the raiders, either braver or more foolish than the rest, fired directly at Nora as she scrambled for cover. Rook moved without hesitation, taking the shot across his shoulder instead, a wound that would have been fatal to something smaller. He barely seemed to notice the pain, roaring loud enough to shake dust from the cliffside, and the raiders broke and ran within seconds, abandoning their vehicle in their hurry to escape. Nora reached him with her hands shaking, pressing her palms against the burned scales near his wound, and for the first time she saw real fear in his violet eyes, not for himself, but for what might have happened to her. "You idiot," she whispered, half laughing and half crying as she held his head against her chest. "You absolute idiot, you could have been killed." Rook only pressed closer, his low, rumbling breath slowing back to normal as she checked him over. Back at Ridgeline, the medical team worked carefully to treat the wound, and though the process took hours and required more tools than anyone had expected to use on a dragon, Rook recovered within a matter of days, his body already stronger and faster at healing than anything the colony's biologists had studied before. The incident changed something in how the colony saw him, where before there had been quiet unease, now there was something closer to gratitude. Rook had not attacked without reason. He had defended people who could not defend themselves and taken a wound doing it. Even Priya found herself bringing him a bit of dried meat from her own ration one evening, standing at a careful but noticeably shorter distance than before. Nora spent her evenings, after that, digging through old records in the station's archive terminal, searching for anything the Threnny Combine had ever written about Vidrikin, curious now in a way that went beyond simple survival. What she found surprised her. Buried deep in old, half-translated files, there were mentions of an ancient civilization, long extinct, that had once lived alongside Vidrikin in true partnership, not fear. The bonding tradition, it seemed, had not always been treated as a danger to be locked away. It had once been treated as something sacred. They outlawed it after that civilization collapsed, Voss explained one night, reading over her shoulder. The official reason was safety. I have always wondered if the real reason was something closer to guilt. Nora looked over at Rook, now large enough that his tail alone stretched halfway across the room, sleeping soundly with one wing draped protectively near her chair. She thought about the frightened, starving hatchling she had found under a pile of stone, and the fierce, loyal creature he had become since. Whatever the reason, she said quietly, I'm glad I found him. Voss did not answer right away. Instead, their communicator chimed with an incoming priority signal, one marked with the Combine's official seal. Voss read it in silence, their expression growing tighter with every line, until finally they set the device down and looked at Nora with something close to dread. The warship has arrived in orbit, Voss said. Fleet Commander Threll is on his way down personally. He wants Rook handed over immediately, and he is not planning to leave until that happens. Outside, as if he had somehow understood every word, Rook lifted his head from his sleep, his violet eyes narrowing toward the night sky where a new light had just appeared among the stars. Fleet Commander Ocean Threll did not walk off his shuttle so much as he stepped down from it, like the ground itself owed him an apology for existing. Tall, pale gray, with sharp angular features common to his species, he crossed the landing pad at Ridgeline Station with 2 armored guards flanking him and a data slate already open in his hand, scrolling through the same report he had read a dozen times since leaving his ship. Commander Reyes met him at the gate, arms folded, doing his best to look calm in front of a man who commanded a warship large enough to blot out the colony's sun if it wanted to. Commander Threll, Reyes said, welcome to Ridgeline Station. I am not here for pleasantries, Threll replied, his translated voice flat and cold through the small device clipped to his collar. I am here for the creature. Bring it to me, along with the human it has supposedly bonded to, and we can resolve this matter quickly. Rook isn't cargo, Reyes said, and Nora isn't handing him over. Threll's eyes narrowed slightly, the closest his species came to an expression of open irritation. You misunderstand the situation, Commander. This is not a request. A bonded Vidrikin is classified as a level 3 regional hazard. It will be surrendered for containment, or this colony's protection status under Combine trade law will be revoked entirely, leaving you with no supply lines, no defense agreements, and no legal standing on this world at all. Word of the ultimatum spread through Ridgeline within the hour, and by the time Nora was called to the main hall to meet Threll in person, half the colony had gathered outside, watching through windows and open doorways. Rook walked beside her the entire way, his massive frame now taller than most of the buildings around them, his violet eyes fixed on the stranger who had come to take him. Threll studied Nora with something close to disbelief. This is her. This ordinary human girl is supposedly the anchor of an unbreakable Vidrikin bond. I'm right here, Nora said. You can talk to me directly. Threll ignored her, turning instead to one of his guards, a handler trained specifically to work with dangerous fauna. Prove the bond's severity, approach the creature, attempt a standard restraint. The handler hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, a containment collar glowing faintly in his hands. Rook's low growl started before the man had even taken his second step, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. Nora reached out instinctively, resting a hand against Rook's foreleg. "Don't," she warned Threll. "Please, he'll see it as an attack." Threll did not listen. He gave a short nod, and the handler lunged forward, attempting to loop the collar around Rook's neck in one fast motion. What happened next lasted only a few seconds, but it left no doubt in anyone's mind about what a fully bonded Vidrikin was capable of. Rook's head snapped around with terrifying speed, his jaws closing around the collar and crushing it to scrap metal before the handler could even step back. A blast of heat rolled off him in a wave, forcing everyone nearby to shield their faces, and only Nora's sharp, desperate shout of his name stopped him from doing far worse to the man who had reached for him. "Rook, stop! I'm okay, look at me." He obeyed instantly, pulling back from the shaking handler and pressing his head down against Nora's shoulder instead, his whole body trembling with barely controlled fury. The handler stumbled away, unharmed but pale as a sheet, while Threll stood frozen for just a moment, the first real crack showing in his composure. "You see," Nora said quietly, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. "This isn't about control. It never was. He's not a weapon, he's family." Threll's composure returned quickly, hardened now by embarrassment in front of his own crew. Family or not, the danger remains the same. This colony has 1 hour to prepare the creature for transfer, or Ridgeline Station's protection agreement is void, effective immediately. Reyes stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall. "Then it's void. We're not handing either of them over, not to you, not to anyone." The Colony Council, gathered nearby, voiced their agreement almost as one, a wall of quiet, stubborn refusal that visibly unsettled Threll more than any weapon could have. He was used to fear. He was not used to people simply choosing not to be afraid. Threll left without another word, boarding his shuttle in tense silence, but the mood inside Ridgeline Station remained far from settled. Voss found Nora later that evening near the enclosure, watching Rook pace back and forth along the fence line, still agitated from the confrontation. "He is not going to accept your refusal," Voss said quietly. "Men like Threll do not walk away from public humiliation. He will find another way." That other way arrived just past midnight, when the station's alarms tore through the quiet dark, red emergency lights flashing across every corridor as a small, heavily armed strike team descended from the warship above, moving fast and silent toward the enclosure where Rook slept curled protectively around the edge of Nora's quarters. The first thing Nora heard was Rook's roar, loud enough to rattle the window in her small room before the alarms even finished their second cycle. She was on her feet and running before she was fully awake, pulling on boots with one hand and grabbing a flashlight with the other, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pushed through the door into the chaos outside. The strike team Threll had sent down were professionals, trained for exactly this kind of operation, moving in tight formation with containment nets and sedative rounds instead of live weapons, under strict orders to capture rather than kill. It made no difference to Rook. He saw armed strangers closing in near the place where Nora slept, and every instinct in his body reacted before reason had a chance to catch up. He met the first two soldiers head-on, a wave of heat rolling off him bright enough to light up the entire courtyard, forcing them back behind their shields. A third soldier fired a containment net that wrapped around one of his wings, and Rook twisted violently, tearing it apart with a furious snap of his jaws before rounding on the source of the attack with a snarl that shook dust loose from the nearby rooftops. Colonists poured out of their quarters at the sound of the fighting, and what happened next was not the quiet, orderly surrender Threll had planned for. Reyes was shouting orders within seconds, directing people toward defensive positions, while Priya Nandan and a handful of engineers grabbed whatever tools and improvised weapons they could find, flare guns, welding torches, anything capable of adding chaos to the enemy's careful formation. It should not have worked. A handful of colonists with scavenged tools against a trained strike team should have ended badly within minutes. It did not end badly because they were not fighting alone, and because the strike team had never trained against an enemy who fought with the kind of desperate, protective fury Rook was capable of. Every time a soldier moved toward Nora's quarters, Rook was there first, cutting them off, forcing them back with bursts of fire aimed carefully enough to scorch equipment rather than flesh, though his patience for that kind of restraint was clearly running thin. Nora finally broke through the crowd and saw him fully in the firelight, wings spread wide, scales glowing faintly along the ridges where his internal heat ran closest to the surface, standing directly between her and 6 armed soldiers. He looked less like the small, starving hatchling she had once carried home and more like something out of an old story, terrifying and magnificent at once. "Rook," she called out, pushing forward despite Ray's hand trying to hold her back. "Rook, look at me." His head turned instantly at the sound of her voice, violet eyes finding her across the chaos, and for a moment the fighting around them seemed to slow. Nora ran the last few steps and pressed her hand flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat hammering fast and hard beneath his scales. "I'm okay," she said, breathless. "I'm right here, I'm safe. You don't have to kill them, please, just make them leave." Something in her voice reached him even through the fury clouding his instincts. His stance shifted, the raw aggression in his posture pulling back into something more controlled, though no less intimidating. He turned toward the remaining soldiers, released one final blast of heat across the ground in front of them, a clear and unmistakable warning rather than an attack, and let out a roar that echoed off the cliffs surrounding the colony. The message landed. The strike team's commander, watching 2 of his soldiers already retreating with singed equipment and another pinned uselessly beneath a collapsed supply crate, made the only reasonable call left available to him. He signaled the retreat, and within minutes, the remaining soldiers were falling back toward their shuttle, dragging their wounded pride and very little else with them. It was not the colonists' strength that had won the night. It was their refusal to stand aside, combined with a bond none of Threll's soldiers had ever truly understood until they felt the full weight of it themselves. What Threll had not counted on was Voss. Throughout the entire confrontation, the station's alien liaison had been quietly recording everything, every illegal order, every unauthorized weapon discharge on a protected colony world. Every detail of an attack that violated at least 4 separate points of Combine law. By the time the strike team's shuttle docked back with the warship, Voss had already transmitted the full, unedited footage directly to Combine Regional Command, along with a formal complaint carrying their own official seal. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within hours, new orders arrived for Threll's ship, orders that had nothing to do with Caldris Reach and everything to do with an inquiry board waiting for him back at Combine headquarters. His warship broke orbit before dawn, leaving without another word, without another threat, without so much as a formal goodbye. Nora sat outside long after the danger had passed, exhausted and shaking with the last of the adrenaline. Rook curled protectively around her despite his own scattered wounds. Around them, colonists worked quietly to repair the damage, some exchanging tired, disbelieving laughter about what they had just lived through. "We actually won," Priya said, sitting down heavily nearby, still holding a bent welding torch like a trophy. "We actually beat a Combine strike team." Nora looked down at Rook, who lifted his head just enough to press it gently against her side, his violet eyes finally calm again for the first time in days. "We didn't win alone," she said softly. "Word travels strangely across the stars. It moves through official channels first, slow and careful, buried in reports and inquiry documents that few people ever read. Then it moves through the unofficial channels, traders and shuttle pilots and board communication officers passing along a good story simply because it is a good story. And that is how the tale of Ridgeline Station spread far beyond anything Nora ever expected. The formal inquiry into Fleet Commander Threll's unauthorized raid took several months to complete, and by the time it did, the findings were impossible for the Threnny Combine to quietly bury. Recorded footage of an illegal nighttime strike against a peaceful colony ordered by a commander humiliated after a public confrontation did not reflect well on anyone involved. Threll was formally reprimanded and quietly reassigned to a distant administrative post far from any position of real authority, a punishment that colony gossip enjoyed describing in increasingly exaggerated detail. For Ridgeline Station, the outcome was something none of them had dared hope for at the start of it all. Rather than losing their protection status, the colony was granted an entirely new classification, one Voss had to explain twice before anyone fully believed it. Caldris Reach was declared a recognized bonded species sanctuary world, a rare designation that placed it under direct combine protection specifically because of what had happened there, rather than in spite of it. "They are not doing this out of kindness," Voss admitted one evening, sitting with Nora near the enclosure that no longer needed rebuilding, since Rook had long since outgrown any wall the colony could realistically construct. "They are doing it because word of what happened here has already reached other systems, and the Combine does not want to be remembered as the power that attacked a colony over an act of simple compassion." "I don't really care why," Nora said, watching Rook stretch his wings out fully in the afternoon sun, casting a shadow that stretched halfway across the yard. "As long as they leave us alone now." Life at Ridgeline slowly returned to something like normal, though normal now included a fully grown Vidrikin who had taken it upon himself to patrol the colony's perimeter each evening, more out of habit than necessity. Children who had once been kept indoors whenever Rook was nearby now ran alongside him during his evening walks, tossing small sticks that he caught out of the air just to make them laugh. Priya Nandan, who had once kept her careful distance, now regularly brought him treats from the kitchen, insisting each time that it was purely for practical reasons and nothing more. The story that spread across the region did more than protect Ridgeline Station. It began drawing quiet, curious visitors from other struggling frontier worlds, representatives of smaller alien communities who had heard about the human girl and her dragon and wondered, cautiously, whether the old bonding traditions their own cultures had once practiced and eventually lost might still be possible after all. Voss found themselves fielding an increasing number of these visits, some purely curious, others carrying genuine hope that something ancient and nearly forgotten might not be gone for good. Nora never quite got used to being treated like something important. She still worked her regular shifts cataloging plant samples, still ate her meals in the crowded mess hall, still argued with Priya about whose turn it was to clean the greenhouse filters. The only real difference in her daily life was the enormous, loyal shadow that followed her everywhere, patient and watchful, never far from her side, no matter where her work took her. One evening, months after the inquiry had finally closed and the visitors had mostly stopped arriving, Nora climbed the familiar ridge just outside the colony fence, the same rocky rise where she had once wandered off the survey line, chasing a strange blue-veined moss. Rook followed easily beside her, his wings occasionally brushing against the low scrub grass as they walked. They settled at the top together, watching the sun sink slowly behind the same red cliffs that had witnessed the very beginning of everything between them. "You know," Nora said quietly, resting her hand against his warm scales, "I almost turned back that day, twice. If I had, none of this would have happened." Rook made a low, rumbling sound in response, something between a growl and a sigh, and pressed his head gently against her shoulder, exactly the way he had done as a small, starving hatchling buried under a pile of broken stone. Nora smiled, watching the last light fade over the colony below, over the lights slowly flickering on in the windows of Ridgeline Station, over the ordinary, quiet lives of people who had somehow ended up defending something extraordinary simply because it was the right thing to do. She had not set out to change anything that day. She had only meant to help a frightened, hungry creature that no one else had bothered to notice. She had called him cute, without thinking, without any idea what those simple words would set into motion. It had been enough. It had always been enough. Not strength, not strategy, not careful calculation, but a small, honest kindness offered to something that needed it. That was the choice Rook had made in return, the moment his eyes had first flashed violet in the fading evening light, and it was a choice that would remain unbroken for as long as either of them lived. Forever, as it turned out, had started with nothing more than a single quiet word, spoken gently to a lonely, frightened hatchling who had never expected anyone to come looking for him at all.